With the sunrise, a light breeze began to whisper through the pines and fir trees and rustled the leaves on the lacy alders. The forest inhabitants began to stir. Across the small meadow, common jays began to sing noisily, and thrush in the willow thickets began to chirp. Ulyanov and I shaved on the bank of a little stream. Dabs of lather were falling from the razor into the stream and being carried away by the current. We shaved deliberately for the first time after the hard fighting for Ropshah. Newly arrived recruits were sitting and reclining on the grass at the feet of fir trees. They were quietly conversing among themselves, sharing items of food from their home kitchens with each other, and listening to each sound in the forest. Uncle Vasia had just finished cleaning his machine gun and walked up to the recruits. We could hear his deep, smooth and calm voice. Our company commander loves for a weapon always to be in good working order. He personally oversees and checks everything, and deploys our forces so that wherever the fascist might stick his ugly snout, he will be defeated. He also keeps a reserve for himself, but, how to say it, not like that which the top commanders keep, a division or two, but only 3 light machine guns and 1 heavy machine gun. At a difficult moment in battle, this is a big help. Vasily Yershov looked over his audience affectionately, wiped his face and greasy hands, and lit up a cigarette. Then he continued. All sorts of things happen in battle. Sometimes the Germans will press you so hard that you lack the strength to hold them back. Right then and there, the company commander will rush up with his reserve, and everything turns out all right. Oh, how our company commander hates to retreat. It puts him in a nasty mood. You say that you're thrashing the Germans. Then why are our guys retreating? One of the newcomers asked. There are all sorts of retreats, my dear fellow, Uncle Vasia responded in an authoritative tone. To run away out of fear is one thing, but a fighting withdrawal is something else entirely. It is true, guys, that we smash them, but we're yielding in the face of their equipment. They have a hell of a lot of tanks, self-propelled guns, transports and aircraft. There's no need to try to convince you. You yourselves have arrived at the front, and you'll see it with your own eyes. It would be better if you told us how life is in Leningrad. Life is bad. An older Red Army soldier in a new uniform spoke up quietly. At first they evacuated the factories, the children, the women, but now the Germans have cut all the roads. Yershov replied sharply, Have they really cut them? Yes, they've cut them. That's so. And where were you born? Are you a Leningrader? Born and grew up there. This is the second time I'm defending it. Everyone fell silent at once and gazed in the direction of Leningrad. There was so much pain and alarm in their eyes, but also a firm determination to defend their city. After breakfast, Ulyanov and I returned to the company command post. Kruglov was sitting at the foot of a low branching oak tree with a greatcoat flung over his shoulders. Hugging his knees, he was pensively chewing a dry blade of grass and looking in the direction of Leningrad, which was now visible to the naked eye. Next to Kruglov, Polytruk Vasilev was lying on his back on the dewy grass, his hands under his head. He was keeping his eyes on a narrow crevice in the trunk of the tree, around which bees were bustling. Victor, look at the bees. Do you like honey? No, thank you. I feel sickly enough without honey. It is galling to see how close the Germans are to Leningrad. The officers fell silent. A simple, sometimes gruff but solid front-line friendship connected these two men. I thought of the death of my own front-line friend, Volodya Sidorov. His friendly eyes, rapid speech and confident step were still vivid in my mind. Where now was his family? Had his wife returned to Leningrad? How he would have suffered through these days, when the fate of the great city was being decided. Abruptly, Kruglov tossed the greatcoat from his shoulders and pulled a cigarette case out of his pocket. He spat out the blade of grass, stuck a cigarette into his mouth, and tossed another one to Vasilev. That's enough of this misery. This won't help anything. Have a smoke and drop by the new recruits? Have a chat with them, Kruglov said with a toss of his head in the direction of the woods. The guys are worried. Vasilev straightened out both arms above his head and then swung them in a way so that he instantly sprang to his feet. "Gymnasts," Ulyanov whispered to me. "Only they know how to get up like that." The Politruk left to visit with the new recruits, the ceaseless sound of fighting carried to us from the direction of Krasnogvardeysk. At dawn we took up new positions. A wide valley stretched in front of us, from the shores of the Gulf of Finland towards Novyi Petergov. It was mostly covered with scrub brush, with grain fields scattered here and there. Leningrad was now quite close behind us. On the enemy side, things were quiet. A damp wind was blowing in from the Gulf of Finland, carrying with it the faint sound of crashing waves. Ulyanov and I were standing guard by Battalion Commander Chistyakov's dugout. Now and then, company commanders and political officers came and went. The entire day was full of bustle. Our unit was preparing to attack. A machine gunner, mortarmen, and we riflemen were standing in an open trench. Here and there you could see the glowing tips of cigarettes as men inhaled, and you could catch the sound of restrained conversation. Though everyone's minds were preoccupied with the coming attack, people were talking about anything else. Many men were inquiring about when and how I had received my new boots. Even as I satisfied all their curiosities, I never stopped thinking about my wife and children. At 7 o'clock in the morning on 15th September, the word was given to our artillery. The ground began to quake beneath our feet. It seemed that the earth had risen and was suspended in the air, swinging from side to side like a hammock. Major Chistyakov was standing next to Kruglov and Vasilev. I watched as the eyes of the battalion commander never for a second left the face of his watch, which he was holding in his left hand. He was watching the minute hand, which slowly moved around the face from the number 6 to the number 7. In his right hand, Chistyakov was holding a loaded flare gun, and as soon as the minute hand indicated 7:35 a.m., green signal flares streaked into the sky. It was our first attack, for which we had meticulously prepared. Company Commander Kruglov had split up the snipers, assigning one pair to each platoon. Ulyanov and I joined Vladimirov's platoon in the attack. As we approached the German trench, our artillery shifted its fire more deeply into the enemy's positions. Senior Lieutenant Kruglov was leading the company on the attack quickly and decisively, in short bounds. With insignificant losses, we reached a railroad embankment, behind which the Germans were taking cover. At the platoon commander's order, Ulyanov and I changed our position and flopped down directly next to the company commander. Soon the commander of the 1st Rifle Company, Lieutenant Vorobyev, came running up to Kruglov and shouted, "Comrade Kruglov, the enemy has been shaken. Why are you lying there? We must keep the pressure on them. You understand? 1 step, 1 minute can decide the outcome of the battle." Kruglov looked with surprise at the lieutenant and asked, "Clamber up onto the embankment without artillery cover." Vorobyev wanted to offer a retort, but couldn't get it out. An enemy shell exploded next to us. Dirt rained down upon us, and there was the nauseating smell of explosives. Vorobyev lay next to Kruglov, tightly hugging the earth. Kruglov seemingly didn't even notice the shell burst. He replaced the drum on his light machine gun and resumed fire. Then he stopped firing and looked at Vorobyev. Their eyes met. Kruglov shook his head. "What? A bit frightened? And you wanted to force me to run across an open field to catch the Germans. Wise up, brother." The lieutenant loudly swore and crawled away in the direction of his company. Kruglov glanced at us and tossed his head towards the departing Vorobyev. A fine commander, but also quite hot-headed, particularly on the attack. The snipers Sinitsyn and Borisov were inseparable friends, fellow natives from the Smolensk area. They were not only the same height, but even in their mannerisms they resembled each other. During a conversation, each man liked to scratch the tip of his nose. They were both courageous, experienced fighters. The friends were now keeping watch on a reinforced concrete culvert, through which the Nazis with light machine guns had twice tried to penetrate our side of the embankment. The snipers had picked them off one after the other. Then Borisov held position, while Sinitsyn quickly crawled to the dead Germans and took possession of their machine guns. Borisov immediately rushed up to his partner, and together they concealed themselves in the culvert. A minute later, we heard light machine guns begin to operate from that direction. Rifle shots and hand grenade explosions joined the machine gun fire. It was riflemen from Viktorov's platoon who had passed through the culvert and engaged the Nazis in battle. Other platoons of our company rushed to exploit this tiny gap, torn into the enemy's position by the 2 Russian snipers. The Germans took to their heels in the direction of a swamp, but many were cut down, while others were taken prisoner. We forced our way into Novy Petergov. On the southern outskirts of the city, the enemy put up fierce resistance, firing from windows and attics. Our battalion surrounded the foes and killed the majority of them, but those that remained alive fought to the last cartridge. Soon even these began to emerge from their cover with raised hands, crying, "We give up, Hitler kaput!" "The vermin, they've run out of ammunition, so now they recall kaput," said Stroyeva as she dragged an enemy machine gunner from a cellar. We pushed on towards Staryi Petergov, but soon we were forced to take cover. The Germans had received reinforcements. Our battalion fought off enemy counterattacks all day. Only with the onset of complete darkness did the fighting subside. The company command post was located on the edge of the city in a badly damaged school building. Ulyanov and I took a seat on the edge of a plank bed, while Senior Lieutenant Kruglov and Captain Ushakov, the commander of a newly arrived naval infantry battalion, were standing at a table and leaning over a map. They were carefully studying alternative approaches to Staryi Petergov. Our company and Ushakov's battalion had received an order to conduct a nighttime reconnaissance in force to determine the enemy strength in this sector of the front. Captain Ushakov was about 35 years old. Of a varying height and compact build, Ushakov was deliberate in his movements and always smiling in conversations. His large grey eyes looked at Yus trustingly. As he began to picture the looming combat, he paid even greater attention to each of Kruglov's words. The captain's naval uniform was brand new and well pressed, just as it should have been. This was going to be his first time to go into combat on land. Kruglov folded up the map, and sensing the captain's close gaze at his cotton jacket, from which tufts of cotton were sticking out, he quickly ran his hand across his unshaven face and said, "We'll attend to these matters after the operation, but if I get killed, you won't remember me kindly." Then Kruglov looked at his watch. "Let's get started, Comrade Captain. There will be no artillery preparation. We've been ordered to launch a surprise attack." We went out into the trench. It was raining heavily. The soldiers and officers, huddled under shelter halves, were straining their eyes to peer through the darkness of the night, trying to make out the enemy's trenches. But the darkness concealed the Germans' positions. Everyone knew that they were going on the attack, and they were ready for it, waiting for the command. In the light of lightning flashes and flares, I looked at Ushakov. His face had changed dramatically from the one I had seen in the dugout. His smile had vanished, and he was perceptibly worried. I understood this transformation. For the first time in his life, Ushakov was going to lead his battalion on the attack, moreover at night, when each soldier must operate with the precision of a watch mechanism. He apparently hadn't had the time yet to familiarize himself with the men of his battalion in any real way. Kruglov appeared calm. He was giving final instructions to the platoon commanders. Then he strolled over to a young sailor, armed with a light machine gun, and asked, "Is this your first time to go into an attack?" "Yes, Comrade Commander." "Keep close to our riflemen. They've been in combat a dozen times, and they've learned how to fight the German swine both day and night." I noticed that some of our new recruits were paying close attention to the friendly words of the commander. Then they turned to us. "Comrades, advise us where and how to act, or else we'll ruin the entire operation." The calm voice of Ulyanov sounded from beneath a shelter half. "Don't rush. You've been told to stay close to us, and we don't need to teach you how to shoot. Just don't stop to worry about your new combat blouses and jackets. Hug the earth even more tightly. But if you hear the order, forward, get up and run without a glance back, that's all my advice for you. Just then, a red rocket soared into the sky, followed by another one. Our company and the Naval Infantry Battalion silently rushed towards the enemy lines. Our lunge was so impetuous that the Nazis couldn't resist it and started to run. We burst into the enemy trench. Having finished off anyone who tried to resist, our soldiers pushed ahead. Soon, however, we ran into heavy machine gun and mortar fire. We had bumped into the enemy's main line of resistance. It was impossible to drive the enemy from it with a frontal attack. The defending German force was much too strong. Kruglov ordered me to find the naval captain and tell him to withdraw his men out from under the enemy fire back towards the railroad embankment, and then to launch a flank attack on the Germans. I quickly located Ushakov and passed him Kruglov's order. Ushakov, however, acted as if he hadn't heard me and continued to attack directly into the teeth of the enemy fire. Kruglov, taking advantage of the darkness of night, pulled his company back to the railroad embankment, where we moved under its concealment to outflank the enemy on the right. In a brief clash, we overran the enemy's forward outposts, and with a loud "Ura!" we plunged into the Germans' trench. Firing broke out also in the streets of the settlement. The Germans were firing machine guns and machine pistols from doorways and windows. They were firing in every direction, apparently believing that the Russians were attacking not only from the front, but the rear as well. The most agonizing thing in battle is when you see two men locked in hand-to-hand combat, but in the darkness of the night, you can't make out which one is yours and which one is the enemy. They might be rolling around in the muck trying to strangle each other, and you don't hear cries, only a muffled wheeze. You might have only seconds to save the life of a comrade. I experienced just such an incident on this night. With great effort, I separated the men locked in mortal combat and pointed the barrel of my submachine gun at both of them. One of them began rubbing his neck with his hands and turning his head from side to side, while the other, with a sudden motion, tried to kick my submachine gun out of my hands and babbled something in a foreign tongue. I jumped to one side and gave the adversary a short burst from my weapon. Then I helped my comrade to his feet. He amiably offered me his hand. "Thanks for the help, brother, or else that swine might have had a death grip around my neck." Together, the two of us started moving towards a heavy machine gun, which was still firing. But someone on our side beat us to it. A grenade explosion rang out, followed by a long burst of automatic weapon fire. The machine gun was silenced. German corpses were sprawled on the street. We had carried out our assignment, though the ranks of our company and Captain Ushakov's Naval Infantry Battalion were noticeably thinner. All the same, we celebrated our small victory. It served notice that we also could attack. Each one of us secretly dreamed of a new offensive in order to drive the Germans from the walls of Leningrad. But we still lacked sufficient strength. The next morning we were forced to defend against furious German infantry and tank counterattacks. For the next 5 days, fighting didn't subside day or night. The Nazis were making every effort to preserve the wedge that they had driven into our lines, and to prevent us from linking up with the Lomonosov-Oranienbaum grouping of Soviet forces. We were separated from the Lomonosov-Oranienbaum grouping by only 2 or 3 kilometers, but we couldn't close that gap. We had to fall back to Novye Petergov. At 7 o'clock in the morning on 21st September, the enemy launched a new attack with large infantry forces, supported by self-propelled guns, tanks and aircraft. Our forces could not withstand this heavy attack and began to retreat to Zavodskaya station. We couldn't hold there, however, and by the end of the day we were compelled to make a further retreat to Strelna, where we finally dug in. The enemy resumed the attack the next day at sunrise, but now we were fighting to the death. After some time, we heard the thunder of a cannonade to the left of us, in the area of Krasnoye Selo, which approached us as time wore on. As I later learned, it was the 2nd Naval Infantry Brigade and troops of the People's Militia, which had gone on the attack against the Nazis, aiming their blow towards Novi Petergof. The hostile forces were split into two pieces, one of which was pressed against the shore of the Gulf of Finland and destroyed, while the other hastily retreated. We entered Novi Petergof for the second time, but couldn't keep our grip on the city. The enemy introduced fresh tank units into the battle, and we were forced to retreat once again. The Germans managed to drive our forces back to Gorilovo station and simultaneously resume attacks on Strelna. Fighting on the shores of the Gulf of Finland flared up with renewed intensity. Our forces were in an extremely unfavourable position. The narrow strip of land that we occupied was subjected to constant bombing from the air and heavy artillery barrages. In order to save our forces, we were ordered to abandon Strelna and fall back to Uritsk. Here, the 6th Naval Infantry Brigade and People's Militia Battalions came to our aid. Thousands of Leningraders day and night were marching to the front. Among them were workers, engineers, professors, doctors, teachers, men and women from every profession. The front and Leningrad had become indistinguishable from each other. In the first days of October, the enemy succeeded once again in driving us back and took possession of Uritsk and Ligovo station. Now there remained only 8 kilometers to Leningrad. A mortal danger now hung over the cradle of the proletarian revolution, the city of Lenin. The front line in our sector passed 500 meters away from some distinctive concrete V-shaped buildings. No Man's Land was a gully, which skirted the east side of Uritsk and ran in the direction of Gorilovo. The engines of tanks and self-propelled artillery constantly rumbled on the enemy side. The Germans were bringing up fresh forces, preparing for the final assault on Leningrad. Infantry on both sides were poised on lines of departure, but remained quiet. Ships of the Baltic Fleet and our ground artillery constantly fired on enemy troop concentrations. Then the date, 13th October 1941, arrived. This day has entered into the history of the heroic defence of Leningrad. Signalmen were finishing stringing telephone lines to the command posts. Artillery men were checking the latest results of aerial reconnaissance on the enemy's firing positions around Sheremetev's former Dacha. The enemy's infantry units were showing no signs of life. It seemed that the Germans had abandoned their lines. But I knew that they were standing in their trenches with their rifles and machine guns, just as ready for battle as we were. All my efforts to catch a fascist in my telescopic sight on that memorable morning failed. The enemy artillery remained completely silent. Our ground artillery was also quiet, although the artillerymen were poised to open fire at any second. There was something both sublime and alarming in this solemn yet menacing silence on both sides of the line. Then suddenly the earth shook. The air was filled with the howl of shells, followed by the hollow crump of explosions, and then the shots and shell explosions merged into a continuous roar, which was accompanied by the dull and extended moan of the earth itself. This was the initiation of the great, decisive battle at the walls of Leningrad. A savage battle went on for 2 hours, with neither side yielding an inch of ground. However, in the third hour of fighting, the German resistance started to crumble, and they started to give ground grudgingly. They lashed back at every step, clinging to each clump of earth. From a fork in the road, our battalion attacked along the left side of the highway directly in the direction of Uritsk. To the left of us, naval infantry and volunteer units of Leningrad workers went on the attack. Retreating, the Germans continued a withering fire from heavy and light machine guns, which had been set up in the basements of the concrete V-shaped buildings and the brick buildings on the outskirts of the city. Hugging the earth, we crept forward, taking cover in folds of the ground and behind the corpses of fallen soldiers. It was impermissible to stop. The Germans might dig in on intermediate lines and counterattack us. Major Chistyakov ordered Senior Lieutenant Kruglov to send forward a group of snipers in order to pick off enemy machine gunners ensconced in the buildings. 6 snipers, Ulyanov, Borisov, Sokolov, Sinitsyn, Stroyeva and I, started off at a crawl towards the ravine. The enemy machine gunners noticed our movement across the open ground and shifted their fire onto us. In order to continue our way forward, we were forced to crawl into a pond and make our way closer to the Germans, while up to our necks in water. We still found the range too far. At a range of 1,500 metres, which still separated us from the buildings in which the machine gunners were sheltering, we could not count upon any accuracy. We had to close within at least 800 metres of the buildings. At last we reached a ravine. Stroyeva and Sokolov were moving in front. Soon they dropped to the ground and signalled for us to halt. Stroyeva turned and reported that German infantry was massing in the ravine. We need to warn our side, but how? Our battalion had already joined battle over by the highway. As the senior of the group, everyone was waiting for my decision. To turn back was impossible, but we also couldn't sit idly by in cover and watch as the enemy prepared a counterattack. I ordered to open fire on the enemy infantry, which was about 500 metres away from Oos. For the first 5 to 10 minutes, the Germans were unable to locate the source of our fire. They were engaged in fighting with Chistyakov's battalion. Over the next 10 minutes, each of us fired a minimum of 50 aimed shots. The Germans grew suspicious and tried to find our position, but we kept firing with the same precision and speed. Zina Stroyeva inserted a new clip and said, "Our senior made the correct decision. Look, guys, they're wavering." With that, she again nestled in behind the telescopic sight. The Germans set up machine guns on the opposite slope of the ravine, intending to fire on the attacking Soviet naval infantrymen from that vantage point. But the machine gunners managed to fire only one burst before Stroyeva and Sokolov picked them off. No one seemed willing to take their place at the guns. Suddenly German helmets emerged from the ravine in front of us, about 300 metres away. We instantly shifted our fire to the new targets. Nevertheless, one of the fascists managed to fire a burst. Sniper Sokolov's head dropped onto his arms. Stroyeva, clutching a hand to her left shoulder, slid to the bottom of the gully. Borisov's telescopic sight was shattered, but he immediately picked up Sokolov's rifle and continued to fire. Ulyanov hurried down to Stroyeva's position and bandaged her arm. Returning to our position at the top of the ravine, Ulyanov said, "The wound isn't dangerous, but we must nevertheless get Zina to some medics." As soon as the bandage had been applied, Stroyeva crawled off to one side, clambered to the top of the ravine, sighted in on a German light machine gun somewhere and opened fire. Germans who had been working their way along the slope of the ravine dropped out of sight. We thought the naval infantry had rushed to our help, but it was Zina. I shook a finger at her. "Sit down and don't even think about getting involved in the battle. We'll manage without you." Stroyeva, as if she hadn't heard me, kept firing. Ulyanov grabbed the young woman and carried her off to cover. "You damned bear!" Zina shouted, trying to beat him off. "You're hurting my shoulder!" From the direction of the highway we could hear grenade explosions, short bursts of automatic weapons fire, and shouts of "Ura!" It was our comrades firing at point-blank range on the German soldiers fleeing in the direction of Uritsk. The naval infantry and Chistyakov's battalion pursued the Germans. In a rage, Zina picked up a handful of gravel and hurled it in the direction of the fleeing fascists. "Oh, vermin, run!" the young woman shouted. She was inflamed. Her combat fervour was muffling the pain of her wound. When our comrades took control of the V-shaped buildings and continued to pursue the enemy towards Uritsk, Zina's face suddenly became covered with large drops of sweat. Only now did she sense the sharp pain in her shoulder. More and more fresh elements of naval infantry were running past our position, continuing to press the attack. Soon we turned Stroyeva over to some medics, and then we returned to our company. Kruglov immediately asked, "Has everyone returned?" "No, Comrade Commander," Ulyanov replied. "Sokolov has been killed, and Zina wounded." "Oh," groaned Kruglov, "today has cost us dearly." The commander made a chopping motion with his fist in the air, and started to walk away down the trench line. At that moment, an enemy shell exploded not far from us. I watched as Major Chistyakov, who was walking towards us, collapsed in the trench. When we ran over to him, he was already dead. A shell fragment had severed his carotid artery a little below his left ear. This day had brought us so much grief. The company's Politruk Vasilev had also been killed. I couldn't even look at his dead face, so anguishing was the pain. I recalled his entire life, our work together at the factory, and the hard path of our retreat from the bank of the Narva River to the walls of Leningrad. The fighting subsided with the setting sun. We carried away the body of the dead battalion commander and laid it at the foot of a mound, next to Politruk Vasiliev's body, and those of our other fallen combat friends. Kruglov took the party card of Georgy Sergeyevich Chistyakov out of his pocket and placed it on his chest. He pulled a photograph of Chistyakov's wife and daughter from the battalion commander's billfold. Kruglov gazed at the photo for a long time, at the luxuriant hair of the major's wife, at her unblemished high forehead, at her large, tender eyes, at her smiling lips. Chistyakov's daughter, a girl about 11 or 12 years old, was standing next to his wife. The girl's face was a copy of her father's. Lively, dark eyes were looking at us. We didn't want to believe that our beloved commander would not open his wise hazel eyes, smile at us, and tell us, "Well, fellows, another precious day has fallen to our soldiers' lot." But the battalion commander's lips were compressed, and his eyes were closed forever. We buried our combat friends on the mound just outside the city of Yuritsk, where the foe had finally been stopped. The day was nearing an end, and it was getting much colder. The front had literally lapsed into slumber. There was not a single rifle shot, only the sound of axes and the scrape of spades carried from the German trenches. Ulyanov, Borisov and I stopped next to Uncle Vasia's machine gun nest. Yershov handed us a tobacco pouch. "Have a smoke, fellows. Now you can take your time and enjoy it. You see what the Germans are doing? They're digging in their spiffy uniforms.